Hi everybody, Miss Butt here with today's class text. I hope you're well. I hope you're keeping safe. And most importantly, I hope you are being kind to one another because it is a bit difficult being at home all the time. So being kind does not cost a thing. So before we start, what's happened so far in our book? I want you to shout it out. Can't hear you. Let's go again. Not quite. Well done. That's right. They found blood on the mountains. They've also found the cleaver that belongs to the butcher. So they suspect he might have some involvement. They're still looking for clues, and the sacrifice did not go ahead. So let's get this chapter started. Also, remember, we are collecting the runes, and I hope you're noting them down. Let's start. So the hall was still buzzing with activity as they returned, despite it being late and dark, while the Carl sat inside arguing over what they should do next. After the failed sacrifice, the rest of the village had gone home or decided to stay up drinking beer. Around the town, fires were burning and groups of men were singing, shouting, and spinning sagas. What does spinning sagas mean? That's right, spinning sagas means that they're making up tall tales, like making up stories. The atmosphere felt tense, and Alva feared that the men plying themselves with drink was surely not a good thing. Voices were raised through the streets, and she could hear proud boasts being proclaimed about who would capture the villain that was attacking their town. Uncle, Alva said, I know we have to find out what's happened to the men, but what about Father's treasure? There is a threatening presence in our mountain, her uncle replied, and people are disappearing one after another. If we can discover more about Bjark's involvement in these latest attacks, then perhaps we can find out what else is on the trail of your father's treasure. We must know about our enemy before we follow Bjorn's clues across Giant's Finger. If we find the silver from the young men at Bjork's hut, we know he was the one who attacked them tonight. Then we can find out who he is, out if it is he who took the casket and seek to decode the runes. You must remember that the English monk and warrior are still missing and could be freezing on the side of the mountain somewhere. As well as your father's fortune, we must find them. Well, Bjark's most likely in tavern now, wrapping his massive mouth around a drinking horn, Alva said. He's a terrible drunk and is of simple mind. I imagine he would have put any treasure he stole from the men safely inside his hut before going drinking. I agree, replied Magnus. We must go to his hut and see if anyone is at home. Why don't you head back home for some sleep and leave Fenrir here with me? Alva glared up at her uncle through her matted fringe. Where Fen goes, I go, she repeated, and I don't need sleep. I thought so, answered Magnus grudgingly. You have your father's stubborn ways and thirst for adventure. Alva, our investigations tonight remind me of when he and I used to explore together. To be honest, I'm very glad you're here with me. Bjark's hut went to the east of the hall, on the opposite side of the settlement of their own. It grew quieter as they moved away from the throng in the heart of Kilsgard, and many of the huts were silent as the inhabitants slept. The butcher's found house faced onto the street, and during the day, Bjark set up a canvas store out the front, where Alva had very often bought meat for the family pot. We must listen carefully and find out if anyone is inside, Magnus said, leaving the path and edging down the narrow space between Bjark's hut and the leather worker next door. The shutters were closed and no light shone from within. Magnus strained his ear to a crack in the wall. Alva held her breath, listening for the snores of the huge butcher. But there was nothing. Magnus pulled her back onto the street, where the main door to the wooden hut stood, strong and very clearly locked. We can't get in, Alva whispered. There is a strong lock, and Bjark will have the key with him. The shutters are bolted, and I can see no other way in. Well, let's see what I can do, Magnus said, with a slight glint in his eye. He pulled his pouch open and began rummaging his hand deep inside. Alva could hear rustles, clinks, and clanks as he riffled between his many useful treasures. Then he drew out a ring of metal, Around the edge were keys of all shapes and sizes. I had a key cutter in Helga make this for me. He was a bit reluctant, but I persuaded him. I needed it for my investigations. He doesn't open all locks. It doesn't open all locks, but includes most sizes and shapes of keys. And I've been lucky wherever I used it so far. Despite her whole body ringing with nerves and excitement, Alva couldn't help but stifle a giggle in her thick fur collar. The contents of her uncle's bag never ceased to amaze her, and while she was shocked that he had such a collection of keys, she wasn't really surprised. She wondered what other locks he had been secretly opening. He began placing each key into the lock in turn. It was a noisy business, and the metal rang out with each failed attempt. Alva kept looking around, fearful that someone would hear them. Don't worry, her uncle said quietly. It means that no one is in, at least, and the neighbors will just think Björk is drunkenly struggling with his lock again. At last, Magnus placed a large key with 4 teeth into the lock. After moving it back and forth, they heard the mechanism slide sideways, and the door made an immense creaking noise and opened. The hut was completely dark, the fire was out, and the hearth was cold. Magnus thought his flaming torch inside, and the warm light filled the room. Alva was startled by the mess inside. At one end, animal skins hung around the walls, while sections of beasts were either strung from the roof or laid out on the long table. The smell was hideous. The other side of the hearth was clearly Björk's living quarters. There was a straw mattress with clothes and rugs strewn over it. All around the floors were tools, cooking utensils, shoes, cups, and half-eaten food, and dirt covered everything. Björk has still not looked after himself since he lost his wife, Magnus said. Alva recalled how the butcher had been married to a local girl, but she died giving birth. Neither mother nor child survived the ordeal. This place is disgusting, she said, her nose covered to ward off the smell. How can he live like this? Forget the mess for now. We need to think where a man like Björk might hide stolen jewels and weapons, Magnus said, casting his eyes around the room. If Björk did take it, where do you think he would have hidden it? Remember, he's a butcher. Let's see. Fen can help, Alva said. If I let him smell that belt buckle we found in Giant's finger, he should be able to find other objects with that smell on them. Great idea. He really is a remarkable creature. Alva, Magnus replied. You've trained him well. Alva has spent many months experimenting with Fenrir's sense of smell. She had hidden objects around the town and enjoyed cajoling Fen as he sniffed the ground, following her footsteps and eventually finding the hidden trophies. Magnus drew the scrap of silver from his pouch and handed it to Alva, who held it under Fenrir's muzzle. Find, she said clearly, looking the wolf in the eyes as she spoke. After a few seconds, Fenrir began moving around the hut, his nose close to the ground. He had to climb over the debris that covered the floor, and he had moved bits of leather and scraps of material with his paws. Searching for the scent, he paced from one corner of the building to the other, sweeping across from side to side. Eventually, he came back to Alva and stared up at her with dark, sad eyes. Don't worry, Fen, she said, ruffling his fur. Turning to her uncle, she said, it's not here. If Fen can't find it, it's not in the hut. Magnus rubbed his beard thoughtfully, tugging one of the bead knots carefully into the hairs. But what if it's in the back? The yards of most of the houses in Kilsgard stretched out in strips of land behind them, and often owners would construct little outbuildings on this ground. They moved out of the house, locking the door as they left. Once again, they squeezed through the narrow passage to the side, careful not to knock on the walls of the leathersmith's hut next door as they went. The yard was as poorly looked after as the house. Weeds lay thick across the earth, and no planting or tilling had taken place for some time. Yet, as expected, a small, dilapidated hut reared out of the darkness at the end of the plot. Fen suddenly took off. He ran straight for the shack and began scratching at the wood. The hut had a simple bar across the door, wedging it shut. Magnus heaved it open and shone his torch inside. A rusty scythe hung on a hook, and dried out bulbs, boards of tangled yarn, and planks of wood lay scattered over the door. In the corners, however, was a bright piece of pale light, a material. Fenrir made straight for it, and he pulled off at the cloth with his claws. As the fabric fell back, the torchlight reflected back a heap of polished metal. Inside a wicker basket was a hoard of glinting weapons, silver bands, and fragments of jewellery. We found it, Alva, the man's riches, said Magnus. We've got him. But the Jarl was not going to like this. Alva ruffled Fitton's fur, proud of how well he had done, but inside she felt anxious. These investigations were a distraction from their main goal. They had to start following the runes. They already knew where to start, at her lake. Yet now they would have to show these treasures to the Jarl and question Björk. It would all take time, and instead she wanted to decode the mystery laid for her by her father across Giant's Finger. They left behind the dark squalor of Björk's house, Magnus dragging the basket of treasure with him through the snow. Alva pondered what they had found as she trudged along the crisp white path. She couldn't understand how Björk fitted into the story. He was a drunk fool, but surely he hadn't the wits to kidnap two men and to try to decode the riddle of the runes. What's more, if Björk had the Englishmen, where was he keeping them? They certainly weren't at his home. Something was missing. Something wasn't right. They were at the main clearing outside the hall, which was still lit around the edges as groups of men and women sat around fires under shelters, arguing and carousing. The huge bonfire in the center still burned, but it now plumping out plumes of black smoke against the white backdrop of snow-covered Kilsgard. Magnus made for the door and banged his fist against it. One of the carls, Flecknir, opened the door. His eyes were bloodshot and looked exhausted. It's you, he murmured. You will not be welcome in here. I will be here. I will be when you hear now. I have discovered more news of the night's event, replied Magnus. Let me in. He pushed himself past the car, and Alva followed, leading Fenrir into the hall. The hall fell silent. Magnus walked straight to the central hearth, ignoring Jarl Erik. Alva moved alongside him, trying to keep her head held high, while her instincts cried out to hide away in the corner of the hall, out of sight. In his loudest speech-making voice, he turned to the benches and began, Listen, a good deal has happened since I left you after the ceremony. You want to sit and talk while I, a true son of Odin, want to explore and discover. With my niece, this wolf here, and my raven, we went to Giant's Finger, on the trail of 3 young strangers. A call went up around the hall, but Jarl Erik silenced it with one finger. Be still, he said. Magnus brings news, and I, for one, want to hear it. Magnus had the wind in his sails now and was in full boast. You did nothing while I used my mind's eye to search for information. My raven said the men were gone, and so they were. We made for the high clearing on the west side of Giant's Finger, where the monk and English earl had camped. There, we found signs that a fierce struggle had taken place. There was much blood, yet the 3 men and their horses had left the site, beaten, but I think still alive. Nevertheless, it was clear that they had been attacked and their possessions had been stolen. We found broken belt fittings, which suggested they were robbed of their weapons. They were weak and young boys, but dripping in silver. A single strong man could deliver a beating and demand their riches. This is how it seemed to us. With the help of my niece and her remarkable wolf, we discovered this. Magnus pulled the cleaver out from his belt. We all know who this belongs to. That's Björk's knife, one of the men shouted out. Indeed it is, said Magnus, turning on him. So we thought it was very likely that Björk had taken the men's treasure in the night and hidden it somewhere in his home. We travelled straight there, again doing something, while you men simply drank and talked. Björk was not there, so we explored his hut. We found nothing until the wolf Fenrir used his God-given gift of smell to lead us to an outbuilding. There the foolish butcher had hidden this. Magnus lifted the basket when he dragged into the hall above his shoulders and tipped its contents onto the broad table in front of Jarl Erik. The sounds of clinking metal rang around the hall of daggers, coins, and silver fittings poured across the wood. In the dancing flames of the burning fire, Viking eyes lit up with excitement. But then came sounds of shock and anger ringing around the hall. How do we know this is all down to you, Magnus? Said one of them from the shadows. This stinks of conspiracy. It is you who has had a bloodlust for the three men. You who trained your bird to disrupt the ceremony, as you could run like a hero into the mountains and prove your wisdom to us. We have no witness to what you found. You could have put the cleaver there yourself. I am a witness, said Alva suddenly. Her voice was small and cracked as she spoke. It felt hard to squeeze the words out of her mouth, and she pulled back her wide fringe of hair, raised her head high, and said again, I am a witness. The room hushed, pausing surprised by the silence, and she tried to recreate the speech-giving voice she knew so well from the men of the hall. I swear by all gods and goddesses, by Freyr and Freya, by Thor and Odin, and all by my uncle says tonight is true. Sweat dribbled down her back and her heart thundered inside her chest, and she carried on speaking. I have been with him every step, and I can justify to all he states. My wolf Fenrir found the knife in the snow. Look, she said, pulling the beast forward and pointing to his nose. He cut his muzzle as he searched for it, and I can describe to you Björk's home, his yard, and the hut where we found the treasure. Turning her eyes as confidently as she could, managed towards the Jarl, she said finally, let Thor strike me down if I tell a word that is untrue. Magnus looked at her with an expression of gratitude as she brushed her hair back over her face and once again and pulled away from the hearth. Fenrir shielding her as she went. But she is your blood relative, another voice raised up. She is sure to support you, and why should we listen to the words of a simple girl? Magnus took an angry step towards the man who had spoken, raising the butcher's cleaver towards him. Alva rushed to his side, pulling back his arm. Hush, said the Jarl Erik, standing up from his broad wooden stool and stepping forward. Calm yourself, Magnus, and do not raise weapons in my hall. Sit and put down that knife. Magnus reluctantly did as he was instructed. Now you can have certainly been busy tonight, Erik continued. As Jarl of Kilsgard, I am not pleased when members of the town take justice into their own hands and fail to keep me abreast of what they are doing and what they have found. It is of great interest. We all know that Björk had become more difficult and unhappy with each passing moon. If it is the case that you found this cleaver in the mountain, I, as Jarl, must discover the truth. He turned to two of the Jarls, Carls. Tori, Grim, find Bjark and bring him to the hall. He will be full of mead, and you know he is strong, so take weapons. Tell him I wish to see him immediately, but do not harm him. The two left the hall, grabbing their spears and shields from the entrance, where all the Carls had to leave their weapons. No arms were allowed near the Jarl's hearth, so Magnus had created further drama by bringing up the cleaver and stolen weapons to Jarl Erik's table. Magnus, said the Jarl, you have displeased me in many ways today, but we are friends and I know you and the girl are wise at investigating. Come up to my bench and let me hear all the details you have. I will need to question Björk when he arrives. Servants entered the hall, bringing jugs of mead with them and refilling the cups of the men around the benches, who kept their voices low. Anticipation hung heavy in the air, and Magnus and Erik spoke quietly but energetically, while Alva and Fenrir slumped into a corner. Alva tried to warm her frozen feet, but the fire was some distance away. The relative calm was shattered by the two Carls re-entered the hall, dragging an unsteady, dirty, disheveled man between them. Alva sat up and paid close attention, cajoling her drooping eyelids into action as she leaned towards the new arrivals. She rose to her feet slowly. Björk! Magnus' voice rang around the hall. The warriors lowered their cups and stared at the group in the doorway. Björk! Her uncle boomed again. I found this basket hidden in your outbuilding. I have been to the mountain and seen where you attacked the young strangers. I have found your lost butcher's knife here in front of the hall. I accuse you. You attacked the three younglings who came to our hall. You robbed them and took their wealth for yourself. Did you also attack the monk and the English earl? If so, where are you hiding them? Half man, half giant, the butcher planted his feet and slowly raised himself from where he'd hung between the two groaning Carls. He was covered in grime, and his beard was matted with straw and flecks of food. He smelled even worse than his house. Alva thought, as he stumbled to his feet and moved towards Magnus with steady, heavy steps. Each time one of Bjark's feet hit the ground, she could sense the warriors of the hall shudder. He stopped only a breath away from Magnus and lifted up his face, which was covered by the scars of many battles. Bjark was old now, but Alva knew he had been a Viking with the strongest men of town and had experienced the thrill of the fight. His left eye was partly closed where the line of an enemy's sword had cut across in many years ago. His beard was still golden. He was covered with a stain of mead. So Alva, he appeared fearsome, handsome, and huge. "Is it me you speak to, great rat?" Bjark hissed, the words slurring into Magnus's face. "Has Loki climbed into your skin? What mischief do you make?" "The whole town is full of terror at these night attacks, Bjark," Magnus replied, his voice quavering slightly. "It is up to me to discover what is happening. My raven followed you today. You went to the hills where a group of foolish young treasure hunters were gathered today. Kraft told me the men were gone, and the mess you left at the site told me everything else. You stole the men's weapons, these weapons." Magnus lifted 2 daggers from the table. Other shiny objects had also tumbled out of the basket. Glistening brooches, belt fittings, metal buttons, and many coins. Everyone in the hall eyed them greedily. Bjark drew his face even closer to Magnus, breathing his words with a menacing grumble. "Accuse me again, wench, and I'll send you to hell with all the other sad, useless Vikings." Putting himself up to his full height, Alva's uncle stared back. "I found this at your home, hidden in your yard, and you have taken these treasures from these poor men, young men, so it is you that took the Englishman and the casket. Do you have your eyes on the greater treasure still?" Bjark let out a huge bellowing laugh. "Stupid, ignorant fool!" Turning to the hall, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. He suddenly seemed sober and strong. "I admit it, I stole from the pompous churls who came from the Jarl Gudmund's lands. When they came into Kilsgard, they passed by me, asking if I had heard of a great treasure. Had talk of great treasure. They were so rude and brash and boyish that I told them I had heard of a monk and an earl and a casket covered with clues. They wanted to know where the men were seen, so I told them of the clearing in the trees and Giant's Finger. There were just 3 boys with barely a beard hair on their chins between them. They were rich, covered in silver and armor. I knew they would camp there, so yes, I went for easy pickings. They were so weak, the men struggled a little, but really it was like taking life from a lamb. I took their wealth, but I did not take the casket from the Englishman. I have no interest in runes." "Why, Bjark? Why did you steal from them?" It was Alva who was speaking now, moving towards the ranting men, and a gentle voice brought about a transformation in the giant. Bjark's huge shoulders slumped. He drew his bold gaze away from the hall and looked at his feet. "I am poor," he said quietly. "Rest assured, I too want to know who is responsible for taking the other men, so they can taste the edge of my sword. I should not have gone to the young men, but I have nothing, and they were so weak. I wanted their wealth for myself, and I knew I could take it. But I see that by doing this, I created more terror for the people of our town. There is no honor in what I did. By the gods, I am sorry." He shrunk in onto himself, and the silent hall began to murmur. Magnus clasped him on the arm. "I think you speak the truth," he said to Bjark. "You to make a speech in front of the hall is brave, and I believe you. I felt that there were 2 different people responsible for these attacks, but this doesn't bring us any closer to knowing who has the casket. You have committed a crime, Bjark, but judgments on this should come from the Jarl." Turning to the men of the hall, he raised his voice, addressing them all. "Now we have to work together if we are to cleanse this threat which moves among us. We have to come up with a plan. Time is running out for the missing men," and Alva felt anticipation rising again, pushing away from the tiredness that rang through her bones. She wanted to get moving. She wanted to crack her father's riddle. She wanted to get to Giant's Finger. So it was a really interesting chapter. So it wasn't the butcher at all, but who was it? So I'd like you to think about who you think it could be. I would also like you to like all of our videos, and I will see you in the next chapter. Goodbye.